It's the OG Fact Checker, here to give you a juicy tidbit of history that's verified. I had hoped to have this episode out in time for Valentine's Day, but I think with this episode I've made a dent in Black History Month. I'd like to thank a former co-worker of mine, a U.S. Navy retired chief who's now a snowbird based in Alabama, for this juicy tidbit on this veteran. When he gave me the name, I was surprised at what I found. And I have to give my former coworker 2 snaps in the snap cup for this one. And speaking of Navy, I'll be talking about a fellow Navy vet for this episode. Do you hear that? That's a cover of Naima, a song by alto saxophonist John Coltrane from High Point, North Carolina, the man whose music seemed otherworldly to some and sheer bliss to those who have heard his album Giant Steps. The main sources I used for this episode are Chasing the Train by J.C. Thomas, published in 1975, and Chasing Train, the John Coltrane documentary, released in 2016. The world is full of comeback stories of people who hit rock bottom, sometimes through their own self-destruction, but find the strength to climb out of that pit of despair to achieve great things. Coltrane is not the only musician to succumb to addiction, and Lord knows he's not the only one to recover and stay clean. However, Coltrane's story, to me, is unique because of the spiritual awakening that occurred once his mind was clear. He vowed to use the gift God gave him to make people happy. He found his purpose. This spiritual awakening led to his critically acclaimed 1964 album, A Love Supreme, an album many would call heavenly, so heavenly that he was canonized as a saint by a branch of the African Orthodox Church, where he is St. John Will.I.Am Coltrane. There is a church, St. John Coltrane Church, still active today in San Francisco, which is why the title of this episode is Worshipping a Love Supreme. John William Coltrane was born in September 1926 in Hamlet, North Carolina, and when he was a baby, he and his parents moved to live in his maternal grandfather's house in High Point, North Carolina. Reverend Walter Blair, pastor of the St. Stephen's African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, opened his house to his daughter's family and to his son's family as well, which made the 3-bedroom house crowded. His paternal grandfather was a Methodist pastor as well, so religion was a part of Coltrane's young life that he just accepted. Those lessons from church stayed with him until his last breath, and his principles, his values, were always on the side of being a good force in this world. Then at the age of 12, Coltrane's life turned upside down. His father, John Robert, died, to be followed by his grandfather, uncle, and grandmother in the same year. The loss of income forced his mother to go north to Philadelphia for domestic work before she secured a stable job at a country club, leaving him in the care of relatives. Thomas's biography doesn't say anything about how these changes affected him mentally or emotionally. The biography does say that before his father died, he was a straight-A student. But by the time he got to high school, his grades slipped because of his new obsession with music. Personality-wise, Coltrane was an introvert. He was quiet and reserved, had an easygoing personality, a poker face, who was open with people close to him. Even during Coltrane's darkest period in his life, battling addiction to alcohol and narcotics, he was a sweet person. You wouldn't know he was high unless he dozed off in front of you. No demons came out. Coltrane's musical ability, I think, might have come from his father, who could play the ukulele, violin, and clarinet. He didn't pick up an instrument until he was 13, and what he could play, he did so by listening and practicing. It wasn't until he got older that he learned how to read sheet music. He started with the clarinet because the pastor at his church was able to get him one so Coltrane could play in the community band. That band was so successful that Coltrane's high school decided to create one. Back then, Black communities were a village, and it was the village who was responsible for Coltrane picking up the alto saxophone. I don't know a lot about music or musical instruments, but what I learned from Coltrane's biography is that it's not uncommon for a clarinetist to transition to saxophone. As the high school band was being formed, he wanted to transition, but he had to prove to the high school music director that he could play. That's when the village stepped in. A guy Coltrane knew who worked at a local diner had a sax. He'd play when business was slow. Coltrane talked him into letting him borrow it so he could learn and practice, and the guy agreed. He took it home, learned how to play a song popular on the radio, and when he was ready, he played the song for the musical director, and voila, Coltrane was now on alto sax. In fall 1943, Coltrane and two childhood friends who played in the band with him graduated from high school, and the three of them left North Carolina to go up north as part of the Great Migration to Philadelphia for factory work. The Great Migration, which occurred between 1910 and 1970, was much like the exodus of the slaves out of Egypt. Jim Crow laws that encouraged segregation and inequality, racial violence that included kidnappings, beatings, and hangings, and poor job and educational opportunities drove 6 million Southern Blacks to the North, Midwest, and the West. This migration occurred in two phases. The first phase happened around World War I when Blacks migrated to cities like New York, Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh to fill factory jobs left vacant by those fighting overseas. If you watch episode 16, The Passionate Pitcher Who Liked to Paint Pictures, on collage artist Romare Bearden, I talk about Bearden's connections to Pittsburgh through family who rented rooms to Blacks who migrated from the South for work and how that exposure influenced his art. The second phase happened during and after World War II until the 1970s, only this time Blacks had spread to California, to major cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, and San Francisco, and to the Northwest, to Portland, Oregon, and Seattle, Washington. Coltrane settled in Philly with his friends, reconnected with his mother. The two had a great relationship, and found factory work. Lucky for him, because he was 17, he couldn't be drafted for the war. So he applied and was accepted to the Ornstein School of Music for lessons in saxophone technique. He transitioned into a nightly routine where he would come home from work, have dinner, and then, once his mind was settled, he'd practice, practice, practice. When it came to his horn, Coltrane's work ethic was on point. A fellow musician told the story of how Coltrane's late night practicing was disturbing others in the motel where they were staying. So Coltrane stopped blowing and just practiced his finger work for the next hour. In August 1945, John Coltrane enlisted in the U.S. Navy to avoid being drafted by the Army, and he was sent to upstate New York for segregated basic training, which he completed in October when World War II had ended. He was shipped on orders to Pearl Harbor in November, where he was assigned to the bass swing band, the Melody Masters, from December 1945 to June 1946, playing clarinet and alto saxophone. Let me sidetrack for a little bit because I want to share something I discovered when I was sorting out what Navy band Coltrane played in. I assumed he played for the U.S. Navy band that we know, which was established around 1900s, plays at official government military functions, and is based at the Washington Navy Yard in D.C. And in the documentary on Coltrane titled Chasing Train, Wynton Marsalis stated Coltrane didn't play all that well, and his playing was nowhere near the level of excellence he's known for. Some sources say Coltrane played for an all-white Navy band in secret without a musician's rating. But I don't see how he could play in secret. Like, did he play off stage? Another source says the band he was in was called the Melody Masters, an all-black band on bass that Coltrane was assigned to after he disclosed on his enlistment paperwork that he was a musician. I felt there was a lack of clarity about this Navy band issue for me, so I went digging. What happened was this. When it was clear that the U.S. would probably enter World War II, Congress passed the Selective Training and Service Act in 1940, known as the Burke-Wadsworth Act. This law required men between the ages of 21 and 35 to register with the draft board. And then, when the U.S. entered the war, men between 18 to 45 years old were required to serve. Now, the armed forces had always been segregated, but one black activist said this separate but equal business in the military ain't happening. That man was Asa Phillip Randolph, president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, a union for black railroad workers that played a powerful role in Washington. Randolph, considered a dangerous Negro because of the power he held, had been fighting that good fight for equality. And when the Burke-Wadsworth Act passed, he was like, Blacks fought and died in World War I for this country, and now we're being called to serve again, and we still got to deal with a segregated military? I don't think so. Here is how much of an OG A. Phillip Randolph was. You see, he knew Congress wasn't going to do anything about it. So he pushed for the Brotherhood at its national convention to pass a resolution that would tell Washington and Congress it was time to end discrimination in the military. One of the guest speakers at that convention was Eleanor Roosevelt. And if you didn't know, Eleanor was an ally. She arranged a meeting between the president and Randolph so he could present his resolution. Randolph rolled up to the White House in 1941 with a black delegation of leaders that included Walter White, executive secretary for the NAACP, and they presented their resolution and made their case for desegregation. Roosevelt appeared receptive, but 2 weeks later, he announced the policy of the War Department is not to intermingle colored and white enlisted personnel in the same regimental organizations. Randolph was like, oh, no, he didn't. He threatened to roll up to Washington with 100,000 black folks strong with no white allies to protest in the streets of the Capitol and right up to Pennsylvania Avenue. As word spread about his plans, people of the Caucasian persuasion started getting nervous, especially Roosevelt, who told his wife to write Randolph and tell him that march is a big mistake. He even tried to get Fiorello LaGuardia, the mayor of New York, to stop him. Roosevelt wasn't getting anywhere, so he called Randolph to the White House for another meeting with LaGuardia present. Roosevelt said, stop the march. Randolph was like, issue an executive order that prohibits discrimination at defense companies and I'll stop it. Roosevelt was like, I can't do that. Randolph was like, it sucks to be you. We're marching. And LaGuardia was like, gentlemen, can't we just all get along? Randolph's threat paid off. President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802, Prohibition of Discrimination in the Defense Industry, in June 1941, which banned discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. But this didn't desegregate the military. President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in July 1948 that desegregated the troops. When Roosevelt signed EO 8802, 5 influential people from North Carolina kept up the momentum and convinced the president and Eleanor to allow and assist with the creation of an all-Negro band as a recruitment tool and to also boost morale among Black soldiers and sailors. The 5 influential people from North Carolina were J. Melvin Broughton, Governor of North Carolina; Frank Porter Graham, President of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill; James E. Shepard, the founder of what would become North Carolina Central University; Ferdinand Douglass Bluford, President of North Carolina A&T State University; and Charles Clinton Spaulding, President of North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. Blacks could only be mess cooks or mess attendants, so to be recruited as a musician was definitely a step up, and it was groundbreaking. The Navy's first all-black band, called the B-1 Band, consisted of 45 blacks recruited from top colleges and high school music programs across the country. 2 of those band members are still alive today. James Benton Parsons, who was the band's director and a Navy reservist, was the first Black judge to serve in a U.S. district court in Illinois. Calvin Morrow, a musician second class who played the French horn, became a school principal. Some Black leaders believed, and I think hoped, that the creation of these bands would jumpstart some desegregation. And I stumbled upon a juicy tidbit that suggested keeping that hope alive was a good thing. I'll reveal more about that in another OG Fact Checker episode this spring. But as it stood at the time, most of the bands were segregated and some Blacks served as band leaders. I believed the band Coltrane played in was one of those bands that formed because of the barriers broken by the Navy B-1 Band. And I think because he gave his occupation as musician when he enlisted, the Navy assigned him to the Melody Masters. His discharge papers do not have the rating of musician. He was undesignated, meaning he had no specific rate, and he was stationed where he was most useful. I would say Coltrane was part of a Navy band, not the Navy band. With the war over, the military was thinning out its ranks, so getting an early discharge wasn't a problem. And this is why Coltrane only served a year in the Navy. He received an honorable discharge in August 1946 and returned to Philadelphia. John Coltrane reunited with his childhood friends in Philadelphia after his discharge from the Navy and returned to his old life of taking music lessons, this time thanks to the GI Bill, and by honing his sax playing, taking any gig that came his way. It was during this time that he met his idol. Well, he was everyone's idol at the time, saxophonist Charlie Bird Parker. Much of Coltrane's earlier playing style was taken first from alto saxophonist Johnny Hodges, whose band he would play in from 1953 to 1954, and from Charlie Parker, before Coltrane would find his own. Coltrane's break from small gigs came right after meeting Bird. Eddie Vinson, nicknamed Cleanhead because one too many potato and lye relaxers gave him chemical alopecia, was putting a band together. After Cleanhead heard Coltrane play one night, he offered him tenor sax in his band, and Coltrane accepted, going on a coast-to-coast tour, playing rhythm and blues, mostly through the South and Southwest, from 1947 to mid-1948. What I learned from Thomas's biography is that playing tenor sax requires a greater column of air because it's bigger than an alto sax. It takes more energy to play. Coltrane didn't like playing tenor sax because of the energy required and the weight of the instrument. But he practiced and he asked others how they achieved their sound, finding a way to adjust his breathing while keeping his sound steady. This is one of the many examples of how Coltrane loved music and playing sax and was 110% dedicated to his craft. But being on the road was tough for an introvert like Coltrane. I don't know if you would call him standoffish because he did socialize with others. He just preferred solitude at times and he kept his circles small. He was still close to his childhood friends, had a loving relationship with his mother, and had a cousin, Mary, who was like a sister to him. And he missed all of them. He was lonely. So he filled the void with Coca-Colas, candy bars, lots of cigarettes, and temporary company, as well as bourbon to calm his nerves. Here's a cute fact. Coltrane had a sweet tooth back then, and during a stop in Georgia, he got a tip on a place that made his favorite pie, sweet potato. Problem was, his teeth were not in the greatest of shape, so he was always in some degree of pain because of the vibrations of the reed on his mouthpiece aggravated his tooth nerves. Plus, he hated going to a dentist. He couldn't handle that drill, man. Coltrane bought and inhaled 3 pies, triggering immense pain that continued into the next day and affected his playing. Clean had noticed and asked him what was going on. Coltrane told him about the toothache, and Cleanhead gave him a bottle of liquor to dull the pain and ordered him to see a dentist ASAP. Coltrane overslept, but he made it to the dentist the next day to have 2 teeth pulled. By that time, the band had moved on to the next gig, and it took 1 to 2 days before he could reconnect with them. Cleanhead was more relieved than angry to see him because he thought something bad had happened to him. I got the sense that in those early days, many saw Coltrane as someone who needed nurturing. Cleanhead said he was a fine young man, and I treated him like a son. Others saw him as this empty vessel who was eager to learn, and certain people along the way placed what they knew into that vessel to help him grow. For example, when John Coltrane was part of Dizzy Gillespie's band from 1949 to 1951 on tenor sax, one person who helped him grow spiritually was Yusuf Lateef, a Muslim convert and alto sax player who turned Coltrane on to Eastern philosophies and religious teachings. He recommended Coltrane read the Quran, poetry from Khalil Gibran, and the writings of Jiddu Krishnamurti. Another musician in the group gave him a book on yoga, while in Earl Bostic's band from 1952 to 1953, one band member recommended he read Plato and Aristotle. From another, he learned chess. His music teacher insisted he listen to classical music and encouraged him to consider soprano sax, which he played on his album, My Favorite Things. Coltrane used everything he learned from books and studying musicians he admired, and he infused his interpretation of that knowledge into his playing and eventually the music he would compose. As stated in the John Coltrane documentary, he was definitely inspired by the concept of the infinite and imagining how science, music, and math all worked together and that there was some kind of universal truth. But his search for truth in his music was derailed for a while. No one can say who exactly introduced Coltrane to heroin. One source stated he was addicted by 1949, but a different source stated it was sometime around 1951 when he was playing for Gillespie. In the Coltrane documentary, a few musicians stated heroin was seen as a performance enhancer because that's how it was marketed by pushers. There are conflicting reports as to whether Gillespie fired him for it. In the Chasing Train documentary, saxophonist Jimmy Heath said Gillespie caught him and Coltrane shooting up after a gig and fired them on the spot. Coltrane begged his way back in, but any promises made were broken, and he was gone for good by 1951. While there may be controversy about whether Dizzy Gillespie fired Coltrane, everyone can agree that it was Miles Davis who famously fired him from his quintet in 1957. John Coltrane drank heavily, and the combination of drugs and liquor made him unreliable. He would have those narcotic nod-offs on stage, and his band members would have to nudge him awake before it became too obvious to the crowd. Davis's bad temper was legendary, and one night he exploded, yelling at Coltrane for being late and his sloppy appearance. Coltrane didn't say anything because he was too high and he wasn't the arguing type. Davis got so frustrated, he slapped Coltrane, who was taller than him, on the side of his head and then punched him in the stomach. Pianist Thelonious Monk, considered by most to be a genius, stepped in, told Davis to chill the F out, and told Coltrane to join his band. The firing was a major blow to Coltrane. He had been playing for Davis on tenor sax since 1955, and Davis was considered the major leagues. He recorded 4 albums with Davis in 1956 that were released in 1960. A year before Coltrane joined Davis's quintet, he met a cute lady at a party, Philly native Juanita Grubbs, who would later be known as Naima, and he fell head over heels in love. He told her after a month of dating that he was going to marry her. They were splitting a hoagie when he said it, and she responded, "How do you know this? You haven't even proposed to me." And he responded, "I'll fix that right now." And he proposed. They were married in October of that year, and now Coltrane was a husband and father to Naima's 5-year-old daughter, Antonia, also known as Saida, from a previous relationship. Antonia described him as a good father who always remained focused on providing for his family. They moved to a little house in St. Albans, Queens, New York, with his mother, and his life was good, except for the addiction. In spring of 1957, he woke up one morning and decided to get the monkeys off his back. He asked Naima, "Will you help me? Will you back me up all the way?" And she said, "You know I will." He then walked into his mother's bedroom and told her the same thing. Elated, she said, "Let's do it. Let's not wait another minute." Coltrane agreed, and locking himself in a bedroom, he fasted and only left his room for bio breaks. Naima doesn't remember how long it was, but it was no more than a week, and when he emerged, he was clean. John Coltrane's method to get clean by going cold turkey was no doubt influenced by his Methodist upbringing and Eastern religion. Here's a note he wrote while recording A Love Supreme. During the year 1957, I experienced, by the grace of God, a spiritual awakening, which was to lead me to a richer, fuller, more productive life. At that time, in gratitude, I humbly asked to be given the means and privilege to make others happy through music. I feel this has been granted through His grace. All praise to God. From that awakening, all good things began to flow. Once he was clean, he joined Thelonious Monk. Coltrane struggled to keep up because Monk's compositions were notoriously difficult, but the challenge made him step up his game. Here was another musician who would set a bar of excellence that Coltrane would rise to meet. His playing with Monk caught the attention of Miles Davis once more. Davis extended an offer to join his sextet in 1959, even though he already had saxophonist Julian Cannonball Adderley, and Coltrane simply said, "Okay." What followed was a flood of creativity that set the stage for the transition to a new sound that would serve as a benchmark for jazz moving forward. From 1957 to 1960, John Coltrane would release his debut album, Coltrane, followed by 3 more in 1958. In 1959, jazz history was made with Miles Davis's album, Kind of Blue, with Coltrane on tenor sax. If you've never listened to that album, do yourself a favor. Find it on your streaming service. Put your phone on Do Not Disturb and listen to it. It's considered Davis's best album. As Coltrane was working on Kind of Blue with Davis, he was also working on his album Giant Steps. Two of the most well-known songs on that album are Naima, after his wife, and Saida's Song Flute, after his stepdaughter. Coltrane stated Naima was his favorite composition. Naima Coltrane was John Coltrane's muse, his sounding board, you name it. They had a good partnership. Whenever he was stuck, he would throw his problem at her, and her answer was normally on point. What led to them separating in 1963 and eventually divorcing in 1966? Well, I think it was a combination of things. Let's just say Coltrane's personal life was messy. Plus, there was X, an unknown variable in both relationships, and there is evidence in Thomas's biography that supports the existence of that variable. Sorry to be talking in riddles, but if you want to know more, read Thomas's book. Coltrane and Alice, his second wife, first met in 1963, but nothing came of it until the following year. Alice, a pianist and harpist, was another great match for Coltrane. The two married in Mexico in 1966, once Coltrane's divorce was final, and moved into a house on Long Island with her daughter from a previous relationship, their two sons, born in 1964 and 1965, and his mother. In 1960, Coltrane felt confident enough to leave Miles Davis's sextet and start his own group, the John Coltrane Quartet. He released Giant Steps with this new quartet, and it was a smash hit. The following year, he had his first radio hit with My Favorite Things from the album of the same name. Alice would join her husband's band as his pianist towards the end of his career when McCoy Tyner, his pianist from the beginning, left the group. Contracted to two record companies, he released 12 albums between 1961 and 1964 that were either a solo album or a collaboration with other artists, like Duke Ellington. After the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, by Klan members, Coltrane released Live at Birdland, and one song on the album, Alabama, was in honor of the 4 girls who died in the church. And then, in 1965, the jazz world was flipped upside down when Coltrane released A Love Supreme. Composed in 2 weeks at his Long Island home, it is considered his best album and one of the best jazz albums of all time. The year John Coltrane released A Love Supreme was the year he met Ravi Shankar for dinner in New York to pick his brain about the structure of East Indian music. Shankar gave him a demonstration on the sitar, showing him how he could bend notes on the instrument, and John Coltrane was mesmerized and inspired. In the Coltrane documentary, President Bill Clinton, a huge fan, compared him to Pablo Picasso and his periods in art, like his blue period, his cubist period, and so on, and that Coltrane went through his periods as well. Coltrane was chasing a new sound by 1965. I remember the term avant-garde being used, and yeah, the term fits. He was deconstructing what he had accomplished with Giant Steps and A Love Supreme and seeking more, something different. The result? Well, okay, let's talk about Coltrane's 1965 album, Ascension. I really wanted this album to speak to me. Again, I'm not a music expert, but I know what I like. To me, this album is this cacophony of sound with no structure or rhythm, with instruments tumbling over each other, and it is so disquieting. It took me a while to realize that I wasn't listening to everyone tuning their instruments. The album starts with 19 minutes of the first of 4 sections titled Edition 1, Part 1. And to my ears, it's a wall of sound that confuses me, like strobe lighting for my ears. My mind couldn't latch on to anything. I got frustrated and stopped listening. Of course, there are many that feel differently, but to me, Coltrane forgot his mission statement for A Love Supreme when he asked God to be given the means and privilege to make others happy through music. Ascension, his last album released before his death, and the 3 albums released after his death, feel like he's introducing a new sound to rewrite the rules of jazz. I listened to his last studio albums, Meditations and Expressions, and I didn't find them as jarring or uncomfortable as Ascension. The avant-garde feel is still there, but there isn't this disturbing wall of sound that you have to work to sift through. I wonder if he stopped to think if what he was producing would make people happy. I found this quote from Coltrane and Thomas's biography. Sometimes I wish I could walk up to my music as if for the first time, as if I had never heard it before, being so inescapably a part of it. I'll never know what the listener gets, what the listener feels, and that's too bad. Fans of Coltrane trying to make sense of his intent defend those albums by saying maybe 1,000 years from now people will understand it, that these albums aren't for us. We'll never know if this is true, will we? In July 1966, John Coltrane got the opportunity to tour Japan, where he had a big fan base and still does. From the moment his plane touched ground with his sextet that included Alice, they faced a tight 16-day touring schedule filled with press conferences, interviews, and performances in Tokyo, Osaka, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kyoto, Kobe, Shizuoka, and Hakata. Harold Lovett, Miles Davis's lawyer who accompanied John Coltrane on the tour, said, "In Europe, we were treated like artists, and that's the way it should be. But here, you'd think we were their brothers, the way they gave us such personal attention." During that tour is when the photo of Coltrane praying in front of the War Memorial Park in Nagasaki was taken. At an interview with editor Kiyoshi Koyama of Swing Journal, Coltrane was asked what he wanted to be 10 years from now, and Coltrane replied, "I would like to be a saint." Coltrane's headaches began during the Japan tour. Drummer Rashid Ali, who had bought a camera for a friend in Japan, tested out the camera by snapping photos during the tour, which he kept as souvenirs. In looking through those pictures later, he noticed that in almost half of the photos taken, Coltrane was holding his side in silent pain. He continued to suffer in silence as he rushed to record a series of albums when he returned from Japan between the fall of 1966 and spring 1967. He also became a father of a 3rd son in March. Many say Expressions, his last studio album, has a finality to it. To me, I felt Coltrane was saying goodbye with Meditations. In May that year, Coltrane had an attack of stomach pain so intense, Alice scheduled an appointment for a stomach specialist. He went to the appointment, but when it came time to do a biopsy, he refused to stay and checked himself out. In July, Coltrane was rushed to the hospital where he died from liver cancer. He was 40 years old. As for John Coltrane's desire to be a saint, it was fulfilled, but it took a while for it to happen. After his death, a group of fans in San Francisco first formed a club that welcomed musicians to jam sessions to search for new sounds, called the Yardbird Club. By 1969, the club pursued a spiritual journey instead of a cultural one through fasting and prayer. The club transitioned to the One Mind Temple Evolutionary Transitional Body of Christ, joining in neighborhood initiatives within the Black community between 1971 and 1974 with the Black Panther Party. In 1981, the African Orthodox Church, founded in New York City in 1921 for Black Episcopalians, where they could worship freely, where Black men could be the rector of a parish, and where Jesus and the Madonna could be Black, extended an invitation to the One Mind Temple to join their church. They officially joined by 1984 to briefly become the One Mind Temple Missionary Episcopate of the African Orthodox Church. After the Orthodox Church granted sainthood to John Coltrane, the name was changed to St. John Will I Am African Orthodox Church, still active in San Francisco. You can listen to their radio program, The Uplift Radio Show, on WKPOO-FM 89.5 on your radio dial in the Bay City area, or you can stream on the TuneIn app. I love history. You came for the truth. Thank you for staying for the story.